Hi, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the score by Bora Yoon. It was just a beautifully immersive way to reflect on the content so far. So I'm pleased to introduce the moderator of our next panel, Dr. Mala Murthy. Mala is a professor of neuroscience here at Princeton University, and she's a member of the executive committee of the Council on Science and Technology. So I'm passing the mic and the Zoom square to you, Mala. I'm looking forward to what the panel has to say.
Thank you, Penelope. It's a pleasure to join this morning. Beautiful talk by Dan Fagan. I'm happy to moderate this panel. We have two panelists with us today, Dr. Ali Nouri and Professor Sam Wang, my colleague in the Neuroscience Institute. Unfortunately, Professor Troyanskaya can't be here with us this morning. She had a medical emergency, but we hope she's doing okay. So let me first introduce our panelists, and then let's get started on our discussion. So Dr. Ali Nouri earned his PhD here at Princeton in molecular biology in 2006, and he's currently the president of the Federation of American Scientists. This is an organization at the forefront of addressing global risks that range from nuclear weapons to pandemics. And in fact, his policy work is focused on addressing the current COVID-19 pandemic, in addition to combating disinformation. Prior to this, he served in Congress, advising senators like Jim Webb and Al Franken over a 10-year period. Professor Sam Wang is an author, and as I mentioned, in the Princeton Neuroscience Institute, he's been here since 2000. His lab's research focuses on the cerebellum, a brain structure best known for guiding movement, but he explores how this structure also guides flexible behaviors and cognitive development. Sam is probably most famous right now for his work on statistical models of polling data and election prediction via the Princeton Election Consortium, and newer work combating partisan gerrymandering. In 2017, Sam founded the Princeton Gerrymandering Project that develops and uses mathematical tests to diagnose unfair outcomes in district maps. So it's a pleasure to have you both here today. Thanks for joining us. Maybe we could start with Ali. The pandemic is on all of our minds, obviously, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on disinformation surrounding the pandemic, the fact that, there seems to be a diversity of opinions on how to combat and deal with the pandemic, even though in some ways the science is clear. And, what is the role of good policy in combating this kind of disinformation?
Great. Well, thank you. Can you hear me okay, Mala?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Great. Well, thank you. It's an honor to be on this panel with you and with Sam, Professor Wang, who was one of my professors when I was a graduate student, and really a role model to so many scientists who are interested in working in public policy and politics. And really thank you to the Council for this wonderful program. I'll just maybe talk a few minutes about the role of disinformation, as you said, Mala. I think there's always been this gap between science and evidence on one hand and public policy on the other, right? And we see it over and over again, and it's most really apparent when the power of particular constituencies overcome science and evidence, right? And I think a good example is the climate change debate, where the science is very clear, but the power of the fossil fuel interests in that case have just been too great to overcome, to the point that the Senate, the US Senate, for example, has never passed climate change legislation. And it's simply because the powerful National Mining Association, which represents the miners, the oil and gas companies, the refiners, their objections have always just been too great to overcome. So this is not a new problem, but of course we have seen an exponential growth in the lack of evidence in public policy just in the last several months during this pandemic. And I think a lot of that is because the issue has become political, right? It did not help to have a pandemic during an election year. We had politicization with Ebola response, we had politicization with Zika response, and now we have politicization to, of course, an entirely different degree with the pandemic response. And it's really because some of those political positions run counter to the evidence, right? So for example, in places where people don't want to social distance and don't want to wear masks, disinformation is being used in lieu of evidence to justify those positions. And what we have seen is that this disinformation is actually quite literally killing people, right? And then there have even been studies to that effect. So the National Bureau of Economic Research did a very comprehensive study, was published early September. And essentially they found that they looked at the very early stages of the pandemic, and they looked at cable news TV. In particular, Sean Hannity's show was downplaying the severity of the pandemic at the very early stages. And Hannity was basically parroting the president by doing that, and really comparing it to the flu. It's not a big deal. It's going to go away. On the other hand, another Fox host, Tucker Carlson, was not downplaying it. So you had this perfect experiment, natural experiment, where you could compare the different demographics, the Tucker Carlson viewers versus the Sean Hannity viewers. And what the researchers found was that the Sean Hannity viewers actually had significantly higher cases and higher deaths in that early phase. And then around March, the narratives of the two news shows kind of merged, and you didn't see the effect any longer. So this is a really serious issue. And when we start to think about pandemic preparedness, we really need to think about the role of disinformation, right? So far we've been thinking about pandemic preparedness as how much testing capacity we have, and how much contact tracing we have, and how much PPE we have, and how much hospital capacity we have. We didn't really think that disinformation was going to be one of the major drivers of the pandemic. And we've been seeing that throughout the course of this disease. So, we've seen it with masks, of course. The country is very polarized on the role of masks. And we have now plenty of data showing that places that have mask mandates do better. And even more recently, we saw it with this idea of herd immunity, right? So we've actually seen a divide in so far as whether we should let the virus rip and just protect the vulnerable population versus implementing comprehensive public health approaches for everyone. And the data is pretty clear. Like we can't let it rip because 30% of our population is actually vulnerable. And there's no way we can shelter and protect that population. But because of the role of social media in particular, where the public is getting 50% of their information on these issues, those sorts of narratives, even though they're not based on science or evidence, tend to go viral really quickly and become very challenging to combat. The last thing I will say is that in addition to the social media, being so rampant with the spread of disinformation, we've now seen the issue where the institutions that we rely on to get our information for this pandemic, the CDC, FDA in particular, we have even seen great damage done to those institutions because of this politicization, right? I mean, and you know, CDC in particular, it's one of our great institutions. It's really a gold standard globally. I mean, other countries named their public health institutions CDC, right after the American CDC. And we've seen what politicization has done in terms of, for example, CDC at one point suggesting that asymptomatic people don't need to be tested and then having to reverse itself. Those kinds of things cause a lot of damage to an institution. Or the FDA, on the other hand, where we have seen a series of approvals for drugs with questionable efficacy. We saw this early in the pandemic with hydroxychloroquine, then we saw it with convalescent plasma. You know, even 2 days ago, we found out that FDA actually did not consult its very important advisory board, which was very unusual when it approved remdesivir for really sick patients. So we have these examples where the politics is driving these decisions, and the damage that has caused to these institutions, I think, really tell us that the system is not resilient enough. That we need to figure out how to protect these institutions and how to protect the public against these kinds of disinformation. And I'm happy to provide some recommendations on how we can do that, but maybe I'll stop there and turn it over to Professor Wang.
Yeah, that's great. I want to come back to policy in a minute, but Sam, I think it'd be interesting to hear from you about the sources of this disinformation. So how is data used to generate public beliefs? What, you know, where does this come from? Are people allergic to data? Is it hard to give them access to the data to learn the truth? You know, how can data get so politicized in the public sphere?
Yeah, I come at this, I want to apologize because I come at this with the idea that some of these answers don't seem to be very well resolved by social science research. And I will also be frank and say that as a physical scientist, I am not the author of any of that research. However, I'm going to start by saying that it would be really good for people to look up work by Brendan Nyhan, Nyhan, at Dartmouth. There are others, but Brendan Nyhan is a really good person to look up on the subject of forming beliefs. Let me just show a little bit of information. I think there's hope and there's also reason for deep concern. And if I have screen sharing capacity, then I can show both of these things. So I'll show a slide in a moment. Survey evidence has shown that over the last 20 or 30 years, that trust in public institutions is down. And unfortunately, science is not immune to that. Trust in governmental institutions is down, trust in the medical profession is down. Very few institutions have escaped this. One of the institutions that has escaped this declining public trust is the military. So the military has still sustained high levels of trust. Another example of declining trust is the clergy. And so our religious institutions, our scientific institutions, and our governmental institutions all have seen declining trust in the last 30, 40 years. And there is some question about why that is. Paradoxically, it comes at a time when it is easier to get information and faster to get information than ever. And of course, one is immediately led to the thought, maybe that's not a paradox. When it is easy for me to get into an argument with someone who is skeptical about the efficacy of vaccines, the person says, oh no, you can't fool me. I've done the research. I've got a Google search that tells me that there's, you know, some metallic substance in vaccines or what have you. And so false information coexists with true information in the public sphere. And this is an extreme level of difficulty. Now, there are those who would say that this is not new, that there's always been false information. To give you an example, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was an entity in the United States called the John Birch Society. And the John Birch Society had all kinds of ideas about conspiratorial operations of our society and government. They believed that fluoridation was put in drinking water for mind control. They believed that communists had infiltrated the highest levels of the national government in large numbers. And these beliefs were false, but it is nonetheless the case that the society believed them. Those beliefs did not spread widely. They were considered nutty and fringe, and occasionally one encountered adherence to those beliefs. And the contrast is that today we have a group such as QAnon, and QAnon has a constellation of fantastical beliefs that involve all sorts of conspiracies, some anti-Semitic in nature. And there's recent survey evidence that about half of registered Republicans or self-identifying Republicans adhere in some way explicitly to the beliefs of QAnon. And so that's distressing. So the first thing I would say is that this disintermediation is a hallmark of trust in our society, of decline in trust. The second thing is that these things are political and that there are large forces that may act in a top-down manner. And this is both encouraging and also discouraging. And let me just show you an example of what I mean by this. So here's survey evidence from the Pew Society, the Pew Research Organization. And if you can see this, this is now Public Trust in Government from 1958 to 2019. And I want to call to your attention this general decline in trust from the Eisenhower era till now. And if you are nostalgic for an older time in which there was more consensus in society, if you're old enough to remember it, you're not wrong about that. You can see here that there was a decline in trust that began during the Johnson presidency, continued more steeply during the Nixon presidency, and continued. But yet there are also cycles in this trend. We can see an uptrend in trust in government and an uptrend first during Reagan, which is to me interesting because he was very skeptical about the federal government, and also during the Clinton presidency. And I should note that during these uptrends in trust in government, these two presidents were reelected. And so one might think, okay, when society is optimistic, when it wants to reelect the president, perhaps trust in government goes up. But now we have the most recent presidency of Barack Obama, in which he was reelected, but trust in government did not go up. And there's not really time to get into it today, but we live in an age of intense political polarization, more intense between the major parties than has existed in any time since the Gilded Age in the late 19th century. And there are ways in which massive inequality, technological disruption, and public corruption, all of these things have reached a high now that have not really been seen together since the first Gilded Age. And so in some sense, we're living in a second Gilded Age. Now, let me give you a little bit of hope. Let's see if I can do this again. I'm sorry, I put these things in different tabs. Let's see if I can do this again. Whoops. Okay. So as to Dr. Nouri's point, here we can see that there is some kind of political divide. And you can see here, this is now a pre-coronavirus set of surveys, again from the Pew Research Center. And you can see here that scientists have generally high levels of credibility, where the scientific method is thought by the general public to produce accurate conclusions. And this is generally true across the partisan divide, at least was until a couple of years ago, with an emphasis among Democrats with high science knowledge. And I'm going to take a speculation that this audience today is a sample in which that particular demographic is pretty highly represented, and that some of these other demographics are somewhat less represented. So in the previous talk, there was a suggestion that that scientists have a responsibility to speak up. And this is both a responsibility that scientists have, but also a bit double-edged at the moment. And the difficulty is that when scientific evidence is itself denied by national leaders, that national leadership can exert a top-down effect. And we've seen this in public opinion on things like mask usage. Also public attitudes towards whether the nation of Russia is a friend or an adversary. So leadership does come from the top, or I suppose, as I think it was either Trotsky or Lenin said, that a fish rots from the head, but you can look at it however you like. But the difficulty is that there's a real upstream battle that scientists now face because knowledge itself has become partisan. If you look at organizations like the New England Journal of Medicine and Scientific American, for the first time ever, these organizations have made a presidential endorsement. And this is not necessarily, in fact, it's not necessarily on policy grounds, with the exception of the coronavirus epidemic. In the case of Scientific American, it appears to be based on opposition to evidence by one major party and acceptance of scientific evidence by the other major party. In fact, one common phenomenon this election season has been Republicans and other conservatives who are opposed to the policy of the Democratic presidential candidate, but say that there are other institutions that are in fact more important than specific policy goals. So just to return to the previous speaker's point, I think there's one difficulty with how to speak for science. And I think that one strength of science that could be emphasized is the fact that science is iterative, and that when you speak as a scientist to the general public, you are not speaking for yourself. You're speaking for a body of people who are constantly criticizing each other, critiquing, peer reviewing one another. And that internal set of controls creates a community of people who do and don't collectively, who may individually be mistaken, and I am often mistaken myself, but as a group, as a community, are correcting one another. So that's one possible way of dealing with it. Getting back to Mala's original question about the use of data, one challenge that we face right now is that the nature of data has changed, where now we have terabytes of data, gigabytes of data that, that come at us. And the difficulty is that the nature of evidence is much less direct than it used to be, where 150 years ago, you could have Michael Faraday doing these public lectures where you put a wire, a current through a loop of wire, and the wires go woo like that, and then Faraday demonstrated magnetic induction to public audiences in his Christmas lectures. A lot of things that scientists claim are evidence-based, such as the causation of climate change by carbon dioxide, yet rely on large quantities of data where one has to form complex models. And that's a challenge. I'm sorry, I'm not showing this anymore, so I should stop sharing this. And so that's a significant challenge. And so one thing that's come up in survey data is that transparency can play a major role in building trust. And given the cards that we're dealt, which is that we're stuck with social media until it gets regulated, we're stuck with microenvironments of information, then transparency is a way in which we can possibly make a difference in our communication. And another is data reduction. By data reduction, what I mean is transparent methods of data reduction that make it easy to see a large body of evidence. So a fairly classic example of something that is not transparent, machine learning is not transparent. Okay, like or if you train a neural network to give outputs, you may think that's convincing, but if I say, oh, I train a neural network model on all this evidence and I get this conclusion, that's got a black box quality. And that is totally admissible within scientific debates when we are trying to work out the answer to a scientific question. But when it comes to public communication, one has to have one eye on transparency as a means of conveying information. And that's a tough challenge. I apologize that I don't have answers, but I just will stop there before I say more things that I don't know the answers to.
Yeah, that's great, Sam. I wanted to follow up on what you just said and maybe turn this back to Ali. You know, in this era of big data, right, where the data is ever more complicated, partially driven by advances in computer science, as you mentioned, that we can store more data, we can analyze more data. And it's become more difficult, both for the public to actually have access to the raw data and to understand it, but also for policymakers. And, you know, are there different choices we have to make in education? And is there, you know, what's your experience, Ali, with how policymakers actually interface with the data? Are they using the data in a meaningful way, or are they just absorbing, you know, distilled sound bites, possibly from unreliable sources? And so, yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Sure. Happy to answer that. If it's okay, maybe I'll just respond to something that Sam mentioned and then go to your question. But you know, as Professor Wang was talking about the importance of communication and trust in leadership, that's actually been one of the major factors that distinguishes the countries that have done well in this pandemic and ones that have done poorly. And it's been, you know, it's been interesting to go back and look at how we thought we were prepared. So, Johns Hopkins actually put out, in collaboration with The Economist, an index of countries that are, best to worst prepared for a pandemic. And they published that index back in, I think it was October of 2019, so right before this pandemic hit. And, in that index, the US came out as the most prepared of any country for a pandemic. United Kingdom was number 2. And you saw what you ended up seeing, of course, is now we know that US and UK are actually, 2 of the worst performers. And unexpectedly, South Korea, Japan, which did not rank very well on their survey, ended up doing beautifully. Vietnam, that didn't rank well on their survey, has had 35 deaths in the last 10 months, right? I mean, it's a miracle. We've had over 200,000, they've had 35. So, and when you go back and look at, where we got it wrong, it's in part because we were so overly reliant on technical metrics, right? The ability to ramp up PPE, the ability to ramp up diagnostics, and where we sort of, did the part we did not pay as much attention to was exactly what Sam mentioned: transparent, clear communication from leaders that you trust. And that seems to be one of the determining factors as to why Japan's doing so well, why South Korea is doing so well. Because when you think about it, we don't have any pharmaceutical interventions until really late stages of disease. But because there's no vaccine, all we have are these non-pharmaceutical interventions like social distancing and masks and hygiene. And for those things to work, you really need a government you trust, that's transparent, that's giving you the right kind of information. And so I just wanted to reiterate the point that was made there. On the role of science and policymakers, I really think this is an area that scientists need to focus on. I spent a long time working in Congress, and I can tell you that there are constituencies who do very well when it comes to Congress, and who show up and really educate members of Congress on their issues. And I would put the agriculture community, the farmers, in that category. We don't necessarily think of farmers as sophisticated policy people, but they really are. And it's because that farm bill every 5 years requires a lot of input from farmers. And so we would meet with farmers on a regular basis. And, when I was working on the Hill, and it was just amazing the detailed knowledge of the bills they had. I mean, they could tell you, section 5 of this particular bill deals with soybeans in this particular manner. And, that level of detail and level of engagement that we had from farmers was really the reason why Congress would do a farm bill every 5 years, like clockwork. Scientists are just not nearly as engaged. When you look at, members of Congress themselves, you have very few scientists who serve. So, in the House of Representatives, there are 2 physical scientists out of 435 members, just 2. In the Senate, there hasn't been a scientist since 1983, since a geologist served from New Mexico. On the other hand, there are lots of lawyers. So half of the US Senate are JDs, and roughly a little less than half of the House of Representatives are JDs. And part of the reason is because law schools really encourage their students to do internships and fellowships in Congress. So, you know, when I was working there, every year on the Judiciary Committee, we'd have lots of students from law schools all over the country who would be doing these clerkships. On the other hand, we don't have graduate students in our science departments who are, you know, enabled to serve in public policy during the course of their PhD, for example. I think it would be tremendously helpful right now for the Senate Healthcare Committee to have, you know, 3 fellows who really understand the vaccine development process, who understand, you know, polymerase chain reaction when it comes to diagnostic testing, so on and so forth. There is a AAAS fellowship program, which, you know, Professor Wang was a fellow, I used to be a fellow. And that's a great program for scientists who get their PhD and then they go on to spend a year in Capitol Hill. But there's few of those. There's a couple dozen of those, and there's 435 offices. So we really, you know, need to do a lot more to bring more scientists into public policy. In addition, last thing I'll say, you know, in addition to having more graduate students who do these internships or fellowships on the Hill, I think there's also a real need for universities and departments to figure out how to involve their faculty members in public policy. You know, as far as I understand, at the moment, there's no incentive when it comes to tenure or promotion for faculty members to talk to their member of Congress, for example, or communicate with the public. Well, why not? You know, why are we just right? Why are we just looking at, you know, the number of publications? Why don't we look at those civically minded areas as ways of promoting scientists and really getting them more engaged in talking to policymakers and the public?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I do feel like, you know, as a scientist that, you know, I need more education on that front, on how to, you know, talk to policymakers. And so, yeah, I do think it should be part of possibly our undergraduate and graduate training, you know, and it's an excellent point. Yeah, I guess there's one thing I maybe wanted to pivot a little bit to talk about the upcoming election. And I guess I'd like to ask you, Sam, you know, there is one area in which I feel that data is being absorbed by the public, and that, you know, that's possibly polling data. People have your website open at all times and they're, you know, tracking polling data and trying to get a sense of what the outcome is. Maybe that's not true across the country, but it is true of a large swath of people and policymakers. And so, I don't know, maybe you could comment on, you know, the role of data in elections, and then, you know, maybe I'd like to come back to sort of what will happen after Tuesday. But yeah, I wonder if we could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Well, for those of you who are not familiar with it, I'm gonna take that invitation to just show you this website. It's a poor, rustic cousin of famous sites like 538, which I think, if you're a data person, is a must read for many people who are interested in looking at the world through the lens of data. But it is true that that there's tons of data that people consume. They take it in the form of polling data. And you can see here that what I do here is what a lot of people do now, which is aggregate polls to come up with a statistical snapshot. And you can see here that there's a snapshot here, which currently shows that based on voter sentiment, if one had a complete sample of voters who cast ballots this year, you would have Joe Biden with 357 electoral votes, which is a majority, and 6 percentage points above what would be a perfect toss-up for the presidency. And by the same token, looking at survey data, Democrats seem to be about 5 percentage points above threshold to retain the House, and to about 4 points above threshold to retake the Senate. And to calibrate these measures, the polling error in 2016, which was kind of a record all-time polling error, when polls pointed in the wrong direction, that polling error was about a 3 percentage point error. And so all of these are larger than the error that occurred in 2016. So the difficulty here that I've discovered, and this in some ways is colored by my own experience, is that people can't get enough of certain kinds of data, whether it be weather or political polling. And the difficulty is how to convey that accurately. And I will say that that one way to do it is to be very technical and get fangirls and fanboys interested in looking at the details. And that's what they do over at 538. One problem is, for instance, communicating on the subject of probability. And the difficulty there is that these margins, which I just showed you, in fact, work quite well to capture the uncertainty and the closeness. You would not kick back and pour yourself a beer or something to console yourself, depending on what you want to happen based on these numbers. You would, in fact, be pretty engaged as a citizen. And so probabilities are difficult because then they are difficult to interpret. For example, 538 had a probability for Hillary Clinton of 70% of winning. That's probably about right, given what the data told us. I had a pretty significant overestimate, and this had to do with a miscalibration of uncertainties on my part. But that's beside the point. The difficulty is probabilities, both 70% or above 90% in my case, get rounded up to 1 because people say, oh, 70%, that's like 100%. But that was not the case. Now, journalists did this. And so the difficulty is that anything you communicate gets filtered through a game of telephone where it goes through people, and journalists thought it was unthinkable that Hillary Clinton would lose the election. And so they saw the 70% and they rounded it up to 100%. And so one difficulty is that. Another difficulty is that in the particular case of political data, that political polling data, depending on how it's reported, can lead to a sense of complacency. So if we report on coronavirus deaths and say that the rate of deaths is going up, that might lead to complacency. But if we report on the fact that there's a strong correlation between mask usage and containment, then that leads to action. And even though we might like to think that data and science are neutral sources of information, the moment that information collides with the public interest, one has to think about what's going to happen to the information we put out there. Myself, after 2016, I've turned very hard away from probabilities because I'm of the belief that probabilities breed complacence in the sense that looking at the weather report does not make you want to go out and seed clouds. It doesn't make you want to go do a dance to try to get the rain to occur. But if I tell you the control of the Senate is going to come down to a handful of races, and those handful of races include races that are within 1.5 percentage points in Georgia, less than a percentage point in South Carolina, Montana, that these are ties, that the number of Democratic seats in the Senate is next year seems to be somewhere between 50 and 56, depending on whether you phone bank and send text messages in North Carolina, depending on whether you send money or knock on your neighbor's doors in Montana or in Kansas. If I start telling you things like that, that makes it more active and engaged. And I think one difficulty is that we do have to think about what happens to our scientific knowledge, whether we can make it persuasive, whether we can make it viral, whether we can turn it into things that people ought to do to engage with society. And so my general take on it is that for myself, I basically, you can find the probability, like I've got a GitHub file, and if you drill into it, you can open up the file, and then the second value in the file is the probability of Joe Biden winning the Electoral College next Tuesday. But I'm not going to tell you that probability, and I'm not going to tell you where that is. You can read the code and you can find it. It's, but that's, so anyway, the point being, I think there's a general question of what to do with data when communicating with the public, whether it be pandemic data or political data.
Yeah, it's true. We do have a responsibility, and I think it's interesting that you both pointed that out. as opposed to sort of throwing our hands up and saying, well, the public, they don't understand our data, or we put it all out there, why didn't they do the right thing with it? And I think that's an important point for all scientists.
That's like leaving vegetables on the counter for your kid to eat. Like, you just can't,
that's right.
you just can't do that.
Yeah, I provided all of it. Why didn't
it's right there. What's the problem?
Yeah. So, Sam actually wanted to ask you a question, Ali, about the Day One project. So maybe I'll just let Sam pose the question.
Is that okay? Thank you, Mala.
Yeah,
I appreciate that. I feel like I'm going off too much, but one thing I'm really interested in is that I would say that the preponderance of data points towards, if the data are approximately correct, off by no more than a few points, and if we have an orderly election in the coming weeks, days. I know it's all going to be resolved by Tuesday, right? Assuming that happens, I would say the middle of the range of outcomes involves a Democratic House and a Senate and a president. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm just saying that one should be prepared for the middle of the range of outcomes. And under that circumstance, you mentioned speaking to Congress. And I think that there's a lot of trust and repair in government that has to happen, not just by scientists, but agencies that are left headless, that are left without staff. There's been an exodus from Health and Human Services, from the State Department, probably from the CDC, because surely it's a demoralizing time for them. There's just this difficulty of loss of trust, and that is at this point perhaps merited. And so there's a lot of rebuilding. And I wonder, at one point I heard about you talk about Day One, and I wonder if you could just talk about what scientists can and should do to rebuild trust, because we've got seemingly a lot of rebuilding of houses to do metaphorically next year.
Sure, great. Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk about Day One project. Maybe I'll just 30 seconds to follow up on the other point you made about challenges at CDC, et cetera. I think, and then this sort of gets at whether or not a future administration, future Congress wants to reform some of these issues. But I think one of the things that we have learned during this episode is that the politicization of these agencies has really hurt our response. And I think, it might be time to, for example, think about how to separate these public health agencies like the CDC, like FDA, from political interference. In the same way that we do it, for example, with the Federal Reserve, right? The Fed is such an important component of our economy, right? They're the people that set the interest rates. And so long ago, as a country, we decided they should have autonomy and they should not be subject to political manipulation and interference. But for some reason, we don't do that with our public health agencies. And we have seen the president, pressure the FDA into approving particular therapies. And as we look to hopefully the deployment of a vaccine, we already have a really tough hill to climb with 50% vaccine hesitancy in this country. And we really need people to have faith and trust in the FDA and its integrity. So I think there's going to be some thinking regarding how do we shelter these agencies. But on the were you going to say something, Sam?
Oh, just NIH has escaped this. I mean, look, as NIH funded scientists, we have the equivalent of home rule where it's a combination of nobody caring about us because we're a bunch of nerds, and who the hell cares about neural coding of action and and its guidance of cross-brain activity and in vivo imaging, blah blah blah. Who cares about that? So we get home rule. Nobody cares about us, and we get left alone to play with our toys. Mm-hmm. But we also, we're the ones who keep the party going, right? Scientists create technology and growth that allows these old members of Congress to die later. And so why did NIH mostly escape this? it feels like there are norms in place that there's been a general agreement that was bipartisan in nature. Everybody leave the CDC, the National Weather Service, the FDA, and NIH alone, because it's just, you know, they're doing good stuff. Leave them with their white coats and their pointy heads to do their thing. Those norms, not just science and like what you're saying, but like just in across society, across the federal government, there are norms about how things ought to be done that seemingly have come into question. And so we have this weird instability, I think, in the last 25 years of politics that's really come to a boil, to the point where Scientific American makes an endorsement. I mean, geez, what's next? Is the Children's Television Workshop going to make an endorsement? You know, maybe they should. So I guess my question for you is like, so you're saying we should create laws that make these agencies independent? Like, I can hear some heads exploding right now.
So I'm saying we need to figure out how to stop political interference in these agencies, right? Because what we've learned is that they cannot withstand the kind of pressure, the kind of political pressure that's coming their way right now from the president. You know, I mean, they've been put in a very difficult position. They have had missteps. They have tried to reverse those missteps, but in the process, a lot of damage has been done to their credibility. I mean, you make an excellent point. Why has NIH escaped this? And you know, I think a lot of that comes down to this you know, old debate about, you know, whether we want to do policy for science or whether we want to do science for policy. And what I mean by that is, when it comes to funding basic and applied research, those are very bipartisan things, right? Everybody wants to fund scientists, of course, to different degrees, because they know that science is the thing that underpins the national health, and science is the thing that, you know, underpins the discoveries that end up in those cool technologies and run our economy, right? Everybody gets that. So we want more investments in cancer biology. We want more investments in AI. We want more investments in quantum. And everybody in Congress would agree that those things are all good, right? They might disagree on what levels should be, but in principle, they all agree with it. Where it gets controversial is where the scientist steps out of, you know, his lab, and starts talking about how my research should impact public policy, right? That's where we get into these controversial areas where science starts supporting positions that run counter to powerful interests, right? So if it's, you know, it used to be things like teaching evolution in schools, which ran against the church. It might be things like, you know, I'm taking measurements of CO2 in the air. There's a problem. We need to reduce fossil fuels, and all of a sudden you have a problem with the business interests. Or in the case of current public health strategies and as relate to CDC, you know, it's things like, well, I've done the research and I know that these are ways to stop the spread of disease, and that might mean some restrictions on some people's civil liberties. And so therefore you have, you know, people who take civil liberties to an extreme, having an opposition to those public health strategies. So you know, I think the difference between NIH and some of these other agencies that set policy is funding, non-controversial, evidence-based policy setting, controversial. So I think that's what gets us into these problems.
So actually, Ali, if I could just interrupt you for a minute. You know, I've done advocacy work on behalf of the BRAIN Initiative, which is a funding component of the NIH in Congress. And it's true, I have the sense that there's bipartisan support for funding basic science and research. However, I'm nervous it's only a matter of time before that changes. And I think the point you brought up with climate change research is very relevant here, where already, the government sees that funding that research could lead to policies they don't like. And so they're going to stop it at the source, as opposed to wait for scientists to take on a policy stance. And so I don't know, I guess I would maybe add that, scientists have to be vigilant and be thinking that, even though research seems protected now, it may not always be, right?
I have a neighbor. I have a neighbor who is a very well-known physicist in our community, and I expressed distress to him about the stability of our democratic system, of our republic. And he said, "Oh, I think it'll be okay. Physics is staying well-funded." And I just thought, wow, okay, I guess everything's fine, dude, because physics is well-funded. I just, I was like, really, I think if I had asked my question differently, but perhaps a different answer would have come. But I didn't, scientists really like their science. I mean, and you can kind of see it, who wants their local community disrupted? But I think the strength that scientists have is that we get to focus on our lovely questions as a separate thing from society. And that's the thing that makes us, it probably protects us, but it also makes us look at our research problems. And I'm really interested, Mala. Actually, if it's okay, I want to ask you a question, Mala. Is that all right?
That's fine, yeah, sure.
So you've done this outreach on Capitol Hill. I'm just really interested in how we as scientists can help other people, like science teachers. And I just wanted to bring this up because somebody brought it up in Q&A. Someone asked, how can K through 12 educators or teachers play a role in supporting student and community understanding of science, data, and increased trust? And I'm really interested in what you, Mala, or perhaps you, Ali, would have to say about that. But Mala, do you have any? And I'm only asking this because I don't know the answer. And I'm just trying, what can we do? Because we're not K through 12 teachers.
Yeah, actually coming to this conversation, I was thinking, more that the onus is on the public to, better education, to interpret data, to interact with data, to be curious about science, and to want to get to the source. And I'm coming away, and I think many of the people listening.
Yeah, they should all install our studio. Sorry, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Is that there is this burden on the scientists, rightfully so, that we have this knowledge, but with that comes a responsibility to better convey it to the public in order, to give people access to correct information. And so I don't have an answer, but I imagine that it comes in part with a collective responsibility from scientists to interface with educators, to give them access to information and to help them educate, the next generation of Americans. And so, I don't know, Ali, maybe this is something you've worked on, which is actually interfacing with teachers and educators.
Sure, and this actually relates back to Sam's earlier question on the Day One project. So maybe I'll tie both of those together. I think one of the issues that we had when I was working on the Hill was we were actually trying to get more funding to STEM teachers so they could take courses and they could take more STEM related courses and become more effective teachers. So at the sort of higher level, a lot of this is how we fund our K through 12 education. We just need more funding and more resources for STEM education and more resources for not just students to become more critical thinkers and scientifically minded, but also for their teachers to have those opportunities to take those kinds of courses. And part of the Day One project that Sam asked me to talk about is this is a project that's essentially a crowdsourcing effort. And the idea is, what are the areas of science policy, technology policy, innovation policy that the next administration should really prioritize? And so the goal here is to build out 100 concrete policies. So one of them, for example, could be this issue of how do you get more STEM in K through 12? And this comes out of the experience of folks who served in prior administrations who recognize that it takes a very long time to put people in positions of leadership, especially when there is a change in an administration, or even if there's a continuation, a second term of an existing administration. That effort takes a lot of time, and it takes even longer to actually develop the public policies that those individuals should be spearheading. So the whole goal of this Day One project, which is being led by a bipartisan council that includes as co-chairs John Holdren, who was Obama's science advisor for 8 years, and Susan Eisenhower, a traditional Republican who is an expert in space policy. The goal of this project that's led by a council of science and technology experts is really to crowdsource from the community 100 policies, as well as actual nomination of individuals who should serve in a future administration and execute those policies. And we've had tremendous support for this. We actually, at the moment, are seeking input, both for public policies as well as nominations for names of individuals. And after we're done with this session, I'll be sure to put the link in the chat for folks who want to contribute to this.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. I guess we're running a bit short on time, close to the end of the session. It's been very exciting and really insightful discussion. Sam, maybe I could ask you to conclude a bit with your thoughts on, education and countering the spread of disinformation. Let's end on a positive note here about the actions we can all take to encourage the use of good evidence and data in the public sphere.
Oh, gosh. I think the one difficulty with this, I know you wanted me to be positive. One difficulty is that these things are spread heterogeneously. And so, for instance, when we here in Princeton engage science teachers to go lobby our legislators in Trenton to make the bog turtle the state reptile, that's a fun local thing we can do. I think one challenge is how to get things out there. Okay, I'll end on something positive. Everything we've talked about has implicitly involved the national government or changing national policy. But one thing I found in the last few years, just working here in our community and here in the state of New Jersey, is that it is a much more friendly playing field to work with your local community or to work with your local legislators. It's just a smaller playing field. I gotta say, like, I can get a reply from my assemblyman. Now, my assemblyman happens to be a plasma physicist, but it is nonetheless the case that your local representative is responsive. And I have very much formed the impression that if we want to act, that we might have this idealized view of ourselves as a unified single nation with shared ideals. Obviously, those things are in question. I'm of the general impression that we're in a rough patch that may get better if you look at demographic trends, that our national conversation may get better in the next 5 to 10 years based on large trends. I hope it doesn't get worse. But I think that there's a lot that we can do talking about all the things we've discussed, but applying them locally at the state level. Go to your state capital, wherever you are in the United States. Go to your local community. And I think that those conversations can really help. If you write letters and provide content to local newspapers, I mean, bless them, they're in trouble, and then they have difficulty getting content. And I got to say, like, when I write an op-ed, it is a really fast path to publication to go through a local. In fact, a few weeks ago, we pitched somebody an op-ed in a local newspaper. This is not relating to science, but it was related to election policy in Minnesota. And the next thing we knew, it was published. And we're like, well, we thought there'd be an editing process, but no, it just went out there. And so I would really encourage people to borrow from political science, channel their inner federalist, and think about the fact that there are levels of authority top to bottom of our society, and think about ways to engage your neighbors and your community. And I think that people find that there is surprising receptivity to these things. How's that? Positive?
That was a very positive note to end on, you know. Thank you. I want to thank Sam Wang and Ollie Nouri for being with us today. This was a really fun conversation and hopefully inspired all the participants out there. So, and thanks to everyone for their questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mala. Audience, I hope you will join us again in 4 minutes. We'll take a quick break. Our next panel will be discussing how data and evidence are presented and communicated. Thank you very much.